Uh, when I hit record, you are not going, your faces will not appear in the recording because I spotlight myself. But if you talk, people can hear you, and that's okay in the recording. You can also post on the chat any questions that you would like. But it's always nice if you do have your video on, assuming you're not munching on lunch. It's always nice to see live feedback, how people are taking the class. Okay, so that being said, it's been a little hiatus. It's been hurricanes and holidays, but glad to be back here, and we're ready to get rolling for our latest edition of Tanya Tuesdays. And the class today is picking up in the middle of a discussion, so it's kind of, I'll have to, as always, give you a little bit of background of what we've been doing. So we are once again on a course of a paradigm of a way to serve God. So the Tanya started off setting the stage. It started off setting the stage. You have a godly soul, you have an animalistic soul. You have, both souls are made up of 10 soul powers, knowledge, wisdom, understanding, kindness, severity, etc., etc. Plus, both souls have 3 garments: the garment of thought, the garment of speech, the garment of action, which are external to the soul. They are not inherent part of the soul. They are garments that the soul wears. Once we set that stage, we said that there's a battle in your body between the godly soul and the animal soul. Who wants to gain full control? And we said that there's no neutral. If one soul is in control or the other is in control, there's no neutral. Then in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, we went to explain to you one paradigm of serving God. And that paradigm of serving God is how we have to meditate about God. And it was actually mostly chapter 16, how we have to meditate about God. And meditation is the ultimate key to having a long-term good connection with God. We explained the necessity for love and awe of God and how the emotions can power our actions. And we also spoke about what happens if meditation doesn't work. At least you tried. But now in chapter 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, we are going through another paradigm. And that is, if you are not the greatest meditator in the world, if you cannot just think about God and meditate about God and create within yourself a great love and awe of God, we're giving you a shortcut meditation. That shortcut meditation is based on the concept that naturally you have a love within your soul towards God. And that love towards God is always within you. And because it's always within you, therefore, naturally, you will not want to disconnect from God, and you will only want to connect with God. And that's kind of been our discussion. And we've started off discussing the concept of non-dual Judaism. There's no duality in the world, which means the world in its essence is one with God. And by recognition of that, you will always want to do what God wants. And doing something that's against God, as we'll explain a little more today, is disconnecting yourself from God. Now, we explained that even the powers of the world that are disconnected from God rely on God, and they need God because God is ultimately giving them their power, but it's a much more backhanded connection. You want a direct connection, you do what God wants. And so we had chapter 22 and 23. We discussed how mitzvot connect us with God because we are doing the will of God. And in this chapter, chapter 23, we've been discussing how Torah is even greater than mitzvot. How is Torah even greater than mitzvot? Because Torah is where not only am I doing the will of God, I am actually connecting with the will of God itself. What does that mean? So again, if you do what I want, you and me are separate people, but you are fulfilling my will. Now, that's a good thing, but you and me are still separate. However, if you can think the way I think, you are, to a certain extent, kind of like me. And that's the same thing. When we do a mitzvah, when we do God's commandments, On the one hand, we are fulfilling his will, but we are still separate from his will. There's God and there's his will, and we are fulfilling his will. When we study Torah, we are now thinking how God thinks. We are using the same thought process that God uses. That's why the study of Torah is valuable, as we discussed, even for topics and areas which will never come to fruition. Even if we're studying a law that will never happen. That's why the Talmud discusses many hypotheticals. These hypotheticals are the way God thinks. This is God's will. It's not doing God's will, it's God's will itself. When we think God's will, when we think the way God thinks, then we are in a bond with God that is unparalleled through anything else, not even through a mitzvah. And therefore, we explained last week that this bond really only exists in this world. Even in the upper worlds, the holier worlds, the more spiritual worlds, they can't even bond with God in the Torah the way we do. Why not? Because they would not be able to handle such light. We in this world, because God's light is concealed, even when we bond with him, we don't fully feel it, and therefore we don't lose our existence. In the higher spiritual worlds, they would lose their existence because they would feel that bond. So in a fascinating way, we explained last time, not last week, but last time, that God's concealment, God hiding himself in this world, actually allows for greater connection to God. Just to give a simple example, children have a beautiful relationship with God. It's a very simplistic, but it's much more pure, and it's much, I don't want to know if I want to say the word real. I mean, it's real to them. It's a much more pure connection with God. As we become adults and we get sophisticated, our connection with God becomes a little too sophisticated, and sophistication actually gets in the way of our relationship with God. It says actually that's why the Baal Shem Tov, the great Hasidic master, the one who started off the Hasidic movement, actually was such a big fan of the simple Jews, because he felt, yes, the complexity that the learned Jews have is a beautiful thing, but there's a beauty that is found in the simple Jews that is not found in the scholarly Jew, and that is that beautiful connection with God, because that connection is not filtered through their complexity of their mind. It's this just naturally deep bond. And so that's a similar thing that I'm explaining here, is that when it comes to Torah, because we actually don't feel, so to speak, we don't see how we're connected to God the same way they do in heaven, we can actually handle a higher and deeper connection with God. No, it sounds weird. You would say, well, if you're connected with God, how could you not feel it? Well, that's one of God's tricks. I mean, just look around the world. We don't see God. Why don't we see God? We don't see God because God manages to hide himself. That's okay. That's part of his plan. Okay, so with that being said, with this preface, we understand now that Torah study is greater than mitzvot to an extent, and that's why he's going to prove it, and that's going to be section 4. So if you have the Practical Tanya, the book, which hopefully you do, it's page 266. I'm going to share the screen as well, and they changed up the whole. Oh, here it is. Share screen options. No, that's not what I want. Let's go to share. Let's share. Okay, here it is. Okay, so let me zoom in, admit. Okay. Sorry, just orienting myself over here. Okay, so up to section 4. So based on what I said, that when we study Torah, not only are we connecting to God in a way that we cannot do through mitzvot, because the mitzvah only, we're still separate from God. We are fulfilling the will of God, whereas Torah study, we are one and one with God's thought process. We are also connected with God even greater than they are in the more spiritual world. So now he's going to prove this. And he says, the above helps us to understand the many sources in Jewish law which indicate that Torah study is more virtuous than all the other mitzvos, even transcending the mitzvah of prayer, whose spiritual influence is great, as stressed in the Kabbalah, that prayer causes the upper worlds to merge with higher layers of emanation, flooding the universe with divine light. So again, prayer is amazing, as he says. Prayer floods all the worlds with a divine light. So why is it that Torah is greater than prayer? He says this is because only Torah is literally one with God without any hiding the face at all, as we have learned in this chapter. And I'm going to explain a little more just a practical point from this section over here. But let's continue. And then he says like this. And as for the fact that this seems to contradict the Talmud's ruling regarding a part-time Torah scholar that he must stop studying Torah to pray, which says that prayer transcends Torah in importance. So he's asking, if you're telling me Torah study is greater than prayer, why does the Torah say, why is the law that a scholar has to stop their studying to pray? And the answer is, this is not because prayer is greater than Torah, but because the part-time scholar legitimately stops his studies in any case and spend time devoid of Torah. If he is inevitably going to stop studying, he might as well arrange a break at his time of prayer. So his point here is like this. If anyways you don't study Torah non-stop the whole time, then the same way you stop for lunch, and you stop for business, and you stop for taking a walk, and whatever else that you stop, so you stop for prayer. But in theory, if you could study Torah the entire time, you would not stop for anything. And the example of this is actually Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was the author of the Zohar. Him and his son were stuck in a cave for 13 years. They were there and they just sat in the cave and they studied Torah. And it says they didn't study Torah. They didn't pray. They studied Torah nonstop. And that's okay. Because if all you do is you study Torah, they did eat and drink, yes, but they studied Torah nonstop. And that's because if you can actually manage to study Torah the whole time, you will not take a break for anything else. Because Torah study is the greatest religious experience possible. So I want to temper this point with the fact that, yes, Torah study is the greatest religious experience possible. And technically, if you could study Torah the whole time, you should. But I want to say, of course, that there are many ways to connect with God, and they all accomplish different beautiful things. If you are of a caliber of a person who will study Torah the whole day, sure, do it. But otherwise, most of us, we need to connect with God in the multiple different ways to really round out our connection with God. Prayer is a time where we're talking directly with God and talking with ourselves as well. It's a time to work on ourselves. We need that in our spiritual experience. Mitzvahs, we need that in our spiritual experience. So all the different manners of connecting with God are very special. And in fact, later on in the Tanya, he will show how there are things that mitzvahs have that Torah doesn't have. So every single thing has its place. What he's saying here is that if you were truly of such a high caliber, you would study the whole time, go ahead and do it. But what I also want to take practical from this is you may be familiar that there are people who literally study the entire time. And sometimes people who are not very involved in our religion feel like, what are they doing? They're wasting their time. Now, obviously, if they need to earn a living or they should go out and earn a living. But assuming whatever reason they have it paid for, their father-in-law wants to pay for them to study every day, all day, and they're truly sitting and they're studying, we have to appreciate that it's a beautiful thing and that it's a very special thing. To be able to study Torah the entire time is a precious and special thing. It's not for everybody, and God needs us to do the mitzvos. In fact, he says elsewhere that even someone who studies the entire time, if a mitzvah shows up that nobody else is going to do, that you have to do it. For example, let's say you're somebody who studies the entire time, but there's a Jew who needs to be buried. You have to deal with that. Even a high priest who's not supposed to come in contact with dead bodies would have to bury a Jew. So my point is, again, if there's a mitzvah that nobody else would do, they would still have to do it because God still needs the mitzvos to be done in this world. But just to appreciate those who study the entire time, because it's become a kind of controversial idea, because there are many in Israel who study Torah the entire time, and some of them possibly are living on government benefits. So maybe it's gotten a bad rap. So I'm not getting into, necessarily the whole structure of how they get paid. My point is that I want to bring out that if someone truly has a legitimate way of studying Torah the entire day, and maybe they're even studying things that are not so practical, that's a beautiful thing. That's just what I want to present here, is to understand that. Because I see often in the, we talk about politics. In politics, we have to understand each other's side, right? Which doesn't exist today. But the same thing, if you see in Israel, the secular hate the religious hate the secular, and it's a terrible thing. But part of the hate on the religious Jews is they look at these people that study Torah all day. Sometimes like they're just a waste of time. Like, what are they doing? So just want to present it here. What are they doing? What special bond they have with God when they do it, when they do that. You're not getting into the details of maybe some of them shouldn't study the whole time, maybe some should. Just the concept. You have to at least appreciate the concept that there is a concept of studying the entire time and that it is a beautiful thing. Okay. Now he's going to go on to the next topic, and that is like this. We said a moment ago that when we study Torah, we have this amazing bond with God, but we don't necessarily feel it. But now he's going to say, but if you think about that bond that you get with God when you study Torah, that could elicit some feelings. In other words, I'll give you an example. Let's say, I'll tell the story. There was, they say the story, there was a guy who was in prison. I'll preface it with the story. There was a guy who was in prison, and in prison, they put him in a room where there was this big wheel, and he had to stand there for 7-8 hours a day and turn the wheel. And so was his punishment. So he would go into the room every day and he would turn the wheel. And as he would turn the wheel, he had all different types of thoughts in his mind. As he's turning that wheel, he would imagine he's powering some great power plant. He's, or he was pulling a gurney, letting kids go ziplining. He had all different ideas of what he was accomplishing with this wheel. And he did it for 25 years. And after 25 years, he was let out of prison. And he goes outside, and he looks right outside the prison to see what his wheel was accomplishing. And he saw there was nothing, and he had a heart attack, and he dies on the spot. This is a story. It was a parable he used to tell us. What's the point of the parable? The point of the parable is that when you do something and or you feel that you're accomplishing something, it changes how you look at what you're doing. So this person was able to get through 25 years of turning this wheel. He had in his mind all these different beautiful things that he was doing. And that changed his perspective. The moment it all came crashing down, he had a heart attack. But he had in his mind all these things that he was accomplishing through turning that wheel. It allowed him to get through for 25 years, pushing this wheel every single day. So the same thing is over here when it comes to studying Torah. If we know what we're accomplishing when we're studying Torah, that could change how we relate and how we study the Torah. Right? So if, let's say, you were doing an action, and, let's say, I don't know, you have some simple job, and then someone comes in and explains to you, oh, well, this simple job actually is helping to save 100,000 people, you would have a different feeling at that moment. It wouldn't just change what you would have a certain level of feeling. And so what the Alter Rebbe is going to come to us is like this. If you can understand and appreciate this concept, that by studying Torah, you become one with God's will. It's not just like a mitzvah where God is God and you are fulfilling God's will, but rather when you study Torah, you actually become one with God. If you can appreciate that, you will relate to your Torah study in a totally different way. You will feel differently about it. If you can truly understand what you're doing, it'll make you feel different. And this goes back to the whole Tanya's paradigm in general, that your knowledge, when meditated upon properly, will affect how you feel. And his point here is going to be is that even if before you started studying Torah, it wasn't easy to start, right? You had to make a commitment, or someone had to bribe you, whatever it was why you start. But once you start studying Torah, if you realize what it is that you're doing, you will get a great and deep level of awe and reverence when you recognize that at this moment you are one with God's will. So let's read that inside. All right, so he says like this. If you are wise, you can make use. This, by the way, is an interesting point. The Tanya's reason of whatever, you're not done. I'll stick to this. All right. If you are wise, you can make use of this idea to become inspired with a great sense of reverence as you study Torah by contemplating how your soul and its garments, which express themselves in your brain and in your mouth, have literally merged in total oneness with a divine will. and with the blessed infinite light, literally, which is disclosed in your soul and its garments. Then contemplate. All right, so number one, you're going to contemplate how you are becoming one with God. Then contemplate, second point, he's bringing up the points that we said before. So he's saying if you contemplate on these ideas, that number one, how your soul and your garments are all becoming total oneness with the divine will. And then number two, then contemplate how all the worlds, upper and lower, are considered zero in his presence and are literally null and void to the extent that divine will does not become substantially enmeshed with them, but it is merely so common in a disengaged fashion. I'm not going to delve deeply in this, but we explained last time how God's will vivifies the world, but does not become enmeshed with the world. So again, so it is merely so as to give them their main life energy and only a glimmer, continue, only a glimmer of the light actually becomes enmeshed with the world, and that minimal glimmer represents the maximum they can withstand without their existence becoming completely obliterated. The above meditation is essentially a summary of this chapter. The Tanya now adds another point, and this will help us to explain the verse. And God commanded us to perform all these laws in order to revere God. The verse seems to have cause and effect the wrong way around. Surely we first revere God, and as a result of that, we choose to perform all these laws, right? So the Tanya is asking a question. If we revere God, then we'll do mitzvahs. What does it mean that if you do a mitzvah or study Torah, then you'll revere God? But based on what we said now, we can understand. Yes, there's a basic level of reverence and awe and fear of God that helps us do the law. But then once we're actually doing the law and studying the Torah, and if we feel what we're actually doing, then we'll have a higher level of reverence. And so that's what he says. I just summarized what he said in the next paragraph, so go to the next paragraph. And it is this higher level of reverence that you can reach through the above meditation. That the awesome sense that having studied Torah, your soul and her garments have literally merged in total oneness with the divine will. So there are, what he's trying to bring out here is there are two levels of reverence and awe of God. So I'm going to say this outside. There is a basic reverence and awe required to fulfill what the person is at, what God is asking of you, that you respect God, therefore you're going to do it. And then there's a deeper reverence when you're actually doing it, that you feel connected with that person, and then you feel a deeper level of reverence. That's what he's trying to bring here. Our awe of God can exist on many levels. And so parenthetically, what he's saying here is a fascinating point, is that not only do you require reverence to do what God wants and to study Torah, once you're studying Torah or doing what God wants, you can now bring upon yourself a greater awe and reverence of God. It's what's called in the Kabbalistic terms, Yira Tata'ah, the lower awe or the lower reverence, and Yira Ilah, the higher reverence, the higher awe of God. The higher awe of God comes actually after we have started doing what we are meant to do. I was going to bring an example of this, but I lost my my thing over here. Okay. But let's bring it in practical terms in our own lives. So I think we experience this all the time. You know, maybe the rabbi calls you up, or maybe you got whatever inspired you, watch a YouTube video, you got inspired to show up to some religious experience. Maybe it's a prayer, maybe it's a Simchat Torah, maybe it's a Purim, whatever it is. And then when you actually go and experience it, you're elevated to a higher level. You feel even greater. That's something that just makes sense, right? And so the same thing here he's saying is like this. To get you to study Torah requires a basic level of reverence towards God. But once you study, you will be connected with a higher level of reverence. And this is what it means. He explains, the Mishnah says, if there is no fear of God, there is no wisdom. And if there's no wisdom, there's no fear of God. So generally we understand, most people understand the Mishnah to be just a nice, rhyme, right? If there's no wisdom, there's no fear. If there's no fear, there's no wisdom. You need to have both. But actually, the Kabbalists explain, this is what I love so much about Hasidic philosophy, and it explains the deep meaning of all these teachings. There's understood at a basic level, but now on a deeper level, we understand it so much deeper. When the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, if there's no fear, there's no wisdom, that means if you don't have any level of fear of God, you're not going to study. And then when it says, and if there's no wisdom, there's no fear, that means the higher level of fear of God, the higher level of awe of God, which comes after the wisdom. So again, if there's no fear, there's no wisdom, it means if you don't have any awe of God, you will not study. But if there's no wisdom, there's no fear, means if you don't study, you won't get the higher reverence of God. So it's not just, you need both. Otherwise, the Mishnah could have said simply, a person needs both fear and wisdom of God. That would have been the quick way to write it. But the reason why it writes it this way is specifically, and that's just something that just parenthetically I love about Hasidic philosophy, is how it shows every verse and every Mishnah and every saying of our sages is written exactly. There are deep secrets hidden in every single line. It says the same thing it says is about that's kind of really the beauty of the Chumash as well, the Torah. The Torah has a very simple way of reading it. You can read the simple story, and it contains layers within layers within layers. It's beautiful. To me, that's where I see the truth of the Torah, by the way. Just, again, this is parenthetically. Something that's true expresses itself everywhere. In other words, if some things are like partially true, right? So, right, it says you can't tell a lie if you don't tell any truth in it, right? You got to tell some truth. That's how you can tell lies. You need to have some truth. Once you have a little bit of truth, people will listen. That's a lot what goes on in politics today, right? That's why the two sides don't talk. They both have points. They both have some valid point, and then they take it to some extreme, and then they can never get along. Everybody can have a valid point, right? Doesn't mean what they're saying in general is true. But the Torah is just so beautiful. It's so true in every little part of the Torah that you dissect. It's so exact. It matches with everything. It's so beautiful. It fits. Everything fits. There's a symmetry, and a lot of that symmetry and synergy, I hope I'm using the right words, actually appear in an extreme way in Hasidic philosophy. Many questions actually are only answered in the deepest levels of the Torah. But when you get there, it's so beautiful and explains why things are written in certain ways, and it's just so beautiful. There's no other way of describing it. There's a whole system, and everything fits. This is just one example. This Mishnah, if there's no fear, there's no awe. Sorry, if there's no awe, there's no wisdom. If there's no wisdom, there's no awe. And it's just a simple Mishnah, but it fits so beautifully with the deeper meaning that's within it. All right. So that, again, for me personally, I think everybody has at some point, we grew up with Judaism, and you have to question, where do you see the truth of Judaism? And obviously there's a philosophical basis to it, but also the truth that I see in the Torah of how everything has this beautiful synergy. There's just no other way to see that unless you say that it's true. Anyways, so here he brought the Mishnah that I just quoted to you of this higher reverence. The sages said, if there's no wisdom, there's no reverence. Okay, I explained that already. Now he says like this, and compared to this higher level of reverence, the Torah is called a mere gateway to the dwelling. The Torah brings you to this higher reverence like a gateway that brings you into a building. So, again, this is just another beautiful thing. The Talmud has many different fascinating things to say about the Torah, right? As you can imagine, the Talmud is a collection of saying of our sages, and some of them are like inspirational quotes, get you to inspire things. So one of the sayings is, the Torah is a gateway to the dwelling. And what does that mean? What it means in Hasidic philosophy means that the Torah is a gateway to a higher level of reverence of God, as explained elsewhere. So the point is that the Torah is not only the end, but it's also a means to another end. In other words, we would think we need to inspire ourselves to study Torah. what we're learning now is that also when you study Torah, it can actually inspire you to come to a greater level of awe of God. And this is why, now I do remember my practical example. Many times people would have questions of faith and questions of, sorry, this smells something burning. Want to make sure there's nothing burning in this out. Second. Talking about burning, they tell a joke, right? A father asks his kids, how do you know when dinner is ready? They say, oh, when the fire alarm goes off. Okay, anyways. Anyway, that's what happens when dads cook. Anyways, but back to our point. So there were people who had questions of faith. And a lot of times the Rabbi would tell them to do a mitzvah. Do a mitzvah, and then let's discuss. Why? Because mitzvahs connect us with God. And sometimes only once we do the mitzvah can we understand it better, right? So a lot of people will say, I'll only do it when I understand. I'll only put on tefillin when I understand the tefillin. I'll only eat matzah and pastor when I fully understand it. I'll only do this when I understand it. But a lot of times you can actually only get to the appreciation and understanding of the mitzvah after you've done it. And today we're learning the secret why. Because through doing that mitzvah or study of Torah, which is the actual example here, you get a certain connection with God. And once you have that connection, then it opens up your mind to a much greater extent. So that's just a very practical scenario. It's kind of like someone who is suffering from mental health issues. It's possible that they'll only understand their need for the pill once they take the pill. And then I'm not pushing everybody has to take a pill for mental health issues. It's just a crude example, but it's to bring out a point that sometimes we need to take the item before we can appreciate it. And so that's one practical takeaway from this topic here today, is that sometimes we need to engage in something, and that actually can help us lead to a higher level of understanding, and in this case, a higher level of emotional connection to God. Now he's going to say like this. He's going to say, even though it's possible that through study of Torah you will get to a higher reverence of God, he's going to say, but not everybody is going to be able to get there. He says, however, since it requires focused meditation on sublime concepts, this higher level of reverence is something that not every mind can hold. But this higher reverence is by no means necessary for worship, so you should not be troubled if it eludes you, as he says. But even if your mind cannot hold this higher reverence, neither a part of it nor a fraction of it, it's probably due to the poor standing of your soul's root source, somewhere in the lower echelons of the 10 spheres to the lowest of the worlds of Asiya. The failure to reach this higher reverence does not in any way invalidate your Torah observance, as will be explained below in chapter 41. So now he's hearkening back to something we spoke about in chapter 2. That's why all these chapters are built on each other. I'm sure you all remember what we spoke about in chapter 2, but I will refresh your memories just in case. So in chapter 2, we discussed how souls all start out in the world of Atzilut. Remember, there were 4 spiritual worlds: Atzilut, the world of emanation; Bria, the world of creation; Yetzirah, the world of formation; Asiya, the world of done, if you want to call it that. And the world of Asiya, there's the spiritual world of Asiya, and there's our physical world of Asiya. We described how souls start in the highest of the 4 Atzilut, and then there's a gestation period, and some souls pop into our world straight from the world of Atzilut, some pop into a world from the world of Bria, some from the world of Yetzirah, some from the world of Asiya. Depends how long they were up there. And I said, based on that, that will define how spiritually attuned you are naturally, right? I described when we gave that class that I find people that are more spiritually attuned than I am, even though I'm, let's say, more religious, but some people are more spiritually attuned. And that has to do with the root of their soul. In other words, where their soul, how processed, let's put it that way, how processed their soul was before it came down to this world. So with that being said, what Tanya here is saying is that if you have, so to speak, a very processed soul, that it went all the steps of gestation, all the way until the lowest level of the world of Asiya, you may have trouble feeling this higher level of reverence and awe, because you are going to be naturally less spiritually inclined. But he says, that's okay, as long as you try your hardest. That's really what God wants of us. And that's okay. That's okay. So what's the practical takeaway? Practical takeaway of this chapter, because we discussed a lot of things in this chapter, and you may have forgotten what we started off this chapter with. But the point of this chapter was that the Torah is really the source of everything. In other words, the world is God's will. The world is what God wants. The Torah is God's will. It says God looked in the Torah and created the world, which means that everything is created from God's will. So the Torah, so to speak, is the source of the world. If that's the case, then we should never feel like our Torah and our mitzvot can prevent us from earning a living and getting what we need in this world. Right? That's kind of how we start. In other words, a lot of times we look at some of the mitzvot as getting in the way of our needs. Torah study takes up time, and I should be spending more time on my business, or prayer gets in the way, or the holidays for sure, especially a year like this, Thursday, Friday, Thursday, Friday, Thursday, Friday. And a lot of times we feel like Judaism gets in the way of our life. But when we understand the Torah is greater than everything, and it's actually the source of it all. So actually, when you connect with the Torah, which is God's will, which is another way of saying connecting with God, when you connect with the Torah, you are actually opening up new channels of blessing in your life. They tell the story of a guy who was in the forest, and he was chopping down a tree. And as he's chopping down a tree with his axe keeps getting more blunt and more blunt. And the people around him tell him, hey, why don't you stop to sharpen the axe? He says, how can I take a break from sharpening the axe? I got to keep chopping down the tree. I got to keep moving. Right? Anybody ever worked like that? Right? You keep working and working and working. Right? Whether they say work smarter, not harder. If you would have taken a 5-minute break, you would have made whatever you're doing a lot faster. The same thing it says about our Judaism, is the prayers we do morning, afternoon, evening, the Torah study that we do every single day. I appreciate all of you are taking an hour out of your busy work week to come here to study. But that's because hopefully you've appreciated what we've discussed in this chapter, that we're like sharpening that axe. We're doing something that, yes, it takes time from our business, but it actually will bring more blessing in everything that we're doing. And that's really one of the great takeaways of this chapter. Now, it was more from the beginning of the chapter, but that's the idea, is to understand what is the root of everything in this world and what's the cause. Where does it all start? Where's the source of the blessing in this world? And what comes from that source of the blessing? And so when one can differentiate where's the source of my blessings, then that's important. It's like, you could be a company that spends all of the day marketing, but if you don't have a good product, you're not gonna go anywhere. Anyways, that's not really a great example, so that could actually confuse. The point is that that's the great takeaway from this chapter, is that Torah, mitzvos, and Torah to the greatest extent connect us with God, and that is the source of all blessing. And if we recognize that, we will realize that these breaks that we take from our work actually bring more blessing into them. Okay, that brings us to the next chapter, chapter 24. I don't know if we're going to get to read inside today, because we only have like 7-8 minutes left, but we are going to start to look at this next chapter. So the previous chapter was really a description of how, and the chapter before that was really a description of how all mitzvot and study of Torah connect us with God. Now we are going to go to the flip side of that. We are going to go to the sins that disconnect us from God. And this is all, again, connected to our original point. We want to get to a point where we have a basic meditation. The basic meditation goes like this. The basic meditation says, I know in my heart that I don't ever want to be disconnected from God. If I were to realize that every sin disconnects me from God, then I would never sin. The problem is we don't always recognize it. So this is what he's going to do here, is he wants to present to you that really every sin that you do is like serving an idol. Would anybody here ever think of converting or serving an idol? No, but he wants you to understand that when you sin, any sin to an extent, it's like idol worship. Any sin to an extent is denying God. How so? Because when you sin, you're basically saying that you are putting your will in front of God's will. When you sin, you're saying what I want is greater than what God wants. So let me give an example. I would assume that most of you here fast on Yom Kippur. Let's take that as an example, right? So we all understand we need to fast on Yom Kippur. It's the one special day of the year. I speak to people, well, no, it's one day a year. I won't fast. But let's say comes another sin. Let's give an example of gossip. You're sitting there in the room, you got a juicy story, and you start to say it, and you start to feel a little guilty, but you say, it feels really good. I'll just tell the story. It's not a big deal. I'll just tell this one story. Tell this one juicy piece of gossip because it feels really good, If anybody here has ever told a juicy piece of gossip, you know how good it feels. Unless, of course, it comes back to bite you. But at the moment, it could feel really juicy. Did you hear? I mean, it's crazy, right? And it's exciting. But what's happening in that moment, if you break it down, is that it's wrong. And you know that it's not what God wants. It's not what people want, but it's definitely not what God wants either. But yet you're saying it anyways, because you are placing your interests and your desires in front of God's. That's the essence of any sin. Any sin basically says, what I want is more important right now than what God wants. And because of that, the Alter Rebbe will say, the Tanya will say, is that any sin, from the highest to the lowest, has one basic shared element, is that you are placing yourself above God. It doesn't make a difference how insignificant the sin is. It doesn't make a difference if you are knowingly putting on your shoes the wrong way. It doesn't make a difference. Let's give a simple example. So it's Shabbat. I'll give an example myself, right? It's Shabbat. And I know, because I study the depth of the law, that certain bags or certain things have to be opened in a certain way on Shabbat. But it's inconvenient. So I'll tell myself, I'm in a rush. I'm going to open it this way, not that way. See, it doesn't seem like a big deal. I'm not lighting a match. I'm not going to work. But the essence of it is the same. Is where I am putting my will in front of God. And to put it in other words, to a certain extent, it is actually denying God. Why? When I sin, what I'm basically saying is not that I live in God's world, but God lives in my world. I'll say that again. When I sin, I'm basically saying God lives in my world, not that I live in his world. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that I only let him in when I want. It's my world. I do what I want. My desire comes first. When I like him in my life, I'll bring him in. Yom Kippur, Passover, no cheeseburgers, Simchat Torah, whatever. Everybody has their own things, right? Where we let God in. It applies to everybody equally. Me, you, no matter how religious you are, we have different areas where we let God in our life. And that's basically saying that the world is my oyster, right? It's my world, and I let in God sometimes, where I like it, where I connect with it. But if God seems right, people say, oh, that sounds ridiculous, right? What God wants, that's just over the top. That's a little too much. That means I am living in my world and I let God in sometimes. Conversely, if there's something that's really seems really silly to me, but I know it's what God wants and I do it anyways, what does that say? Now, obviously, number one, it says I put God's will in front of my will. But number two, it also says that I live in God's world. In other words, yes, it's more convenient for me to do what I want, but I recognize that this whole world is one with God. And so why would I want, even for a moment, to not do what's part of his will? It's his world. Just imagine for a moment that you were a character in a video game, in God's video game. Why would the character do anything that the creator of the video game wants? You're living in the video game creator's world. We're living in God's world. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to present to you is that any sin, really any sin, has the same basic element. Some sins you might say are more severe. Well, Rabbi, isn't adultery much worse than saying gossip? The damage of the sin is 100% worse. But there is an essential element to every sin that is the same. And the element of every sin that's the same is you are basically saying that your will is more important than God's will. And it's another way of saying that it's your world, not God's world. Because what you want comes first. If you fully appreciate it was God's world and that he's letting you be a part of it, you would always follow his will. By the way, I'm not there either. I'm just pointing out. But so even though, yes, the damage of certain sins are worse than others, I don't think anybody would say that the damage of murder or idolatry or sexual sins or whatever it is, the damage is not worse. But the essence of any sin is basically saying, I am going to put my will before God's. And that's another way of basically denying God's existence to an extent, because you're basically saying that there's a corner of the world is mine. It's not God's. If you fully recognize it was God's, you wouldn't be doing it. So let's read. Let's just read this line here, and then we'll go. Let me read this line that sums up what I just said, and then we're going to go for today, and we'll continue next week. This is the final powerful push that the Tanya is going to make. The whole build that they've been doing for the last 7 chapters, all concludes in this chapter 24. It says like this: God has made one opposite the other, namely the 365 mitzvahs of the Torah, which are prohibitions, as well as the prohibitions of rabbinic law. How are these mirror images, spiritually speaking, of positive commandments? So he's going to say, just as a positive commandment connects you with God, a negative commandment disconnects you from God, because these biblical and rabbinical prohibitions are acts which are against God's will and wisdom. By the way, if you say, how is a rabbinic prohibition against God's will and wisdom? That's because God says in the Torah to listen to the rabbis. Okay, I'm tooting my own horn. Okay. And they are the very opposite of what he wants. The Tanya now frames the discussion in terms of non-dual idea, which we learned in the previous chapter. They are acts which have splintered from God's non-dual reality of oneness in a literal complete detachment. In chapter 23, we learned that Torah and mitzvahs represent a worldly packaging of non-dual reality. Whether you're conscious of it or not, when you study Torah and observe mitzvahs, your soul, your mind, and your body are in a place of a non-dual energy, divine light, which never suffered any diminishment, right? Remember, so we explained how truly this world is one with God. We don't see it, but when we do a mitzvah, we are connecting with that energy. Here in chapter 24, we learn that prohibitions represent the very opposite of mitzvahs. They are acts which represent a complete rejection of the non-dual reality, affirming instead separate consciousness and detached reality. In this sense, the prohibitions are like the sitrach and the klipa, which are called idolatry and other gods, since their existence is a product of the hiding of God's face, an eclipse of divine will, as mentioned above, chapter 22. In the non-dual paradigm, rejecting idolatry doesn't only mean that you deny the existence of any deity outside of God. It means that you reject the notion of anything existing outside of God, right? Now, so we tend to think that idolatry means believing that there's a separate power of God. But what we explain there is that, no, idolatry really is believing that there's anything outside of God, even your table and your choices. It means that you reject the notion of anything outside. Okay, a prohibition of the Torah and idolatry are essentially coming from the same worldview. They affirm separateness and detachment from God are real. It's what I said earlier. When you sin, you're in essence saying that it's your world and sometimes you let God in. In chapter 23, we learned that when a person does a mitzvah, his soul, garments, as well as his body, become a chariot to divine will and merge with the sublime energy of God's non-dual oneness. Now the Tanya will teach us that when a person transgresses a prohibition, the reverse happens. His soul, garments, and his body merge with the powers of separateness and klipa. And that's where we're going to stop for this week. But it's an important thing to ponder. It's an important thing to ponder. And that is, we'll have to come back to this, and that is that that any sin, all sins are really the same. All sins are really the same. Think about that idea. How are all sins, how is there an element of sins that are all the same? And that's something to think about as you continue on your next week. What part of sin? And as I explained, hopefully well enough, but think about it. And if you have any pushback, that every sin is in essence saying any sin, no matter how great or minor, is saying that it's my choice that matters. It's my will that matters most, which is in other words saying it's my world. And when I want to let in God, I'm going to let in God. And when I don't want to let him in, I won't let him in. So there's an element of every sin that is the same, no matter how severe or light. I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll pick up next Tuesday.